Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. If you're joining us on YouTube, thanks for stopping by. We'd really appreciate if you would like, comment, and subscribe. This is Ask the Expert, where experts in the field answer your questions about topics related to aphasia. In today's session, Dr. Sarah Wallace will be discussing technology and strategies to support reading for people with aphasia. Dr. Sarah Wallace is a professor and director at the University of Pittsburgh, where she also serves as the program director for the Adult Language and Cognition Clinic. Dr. Wallace is a speech-language pathologist with clinical experience providing services to individuals with acquired communication disorders. Sarah, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Jen. Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for joining us, whether you're joining us live tonight or you're joining us and watching this recording at a later date. I'm really pleased to have a chance to talk a little bit about this topic. And maybe many of you are already familiar with sort of the format for tonight, but I'm going to do my best to do a quick overview about the topic and provide some background and share some of the newest, latest information about the topic. And then I'll leave some time so that I can answer questions that people might have. And we can have more of a discussion as we move forward. So I do have a slide here with some of my disclosures. It just indicates some of the funding that I have to do some of the research projects that I'm going to be sharing some of the information from this evening. And then I think a lot of us know the value of teams and of working with other people. And so I just want to emphasize that I don't do this work alone, that I have the great pleasure of working with many, many more collaborators than who will fit on this slide. But in general, I want to emphasize the teams who've worked with me on some topics related to reading. My colleagues are from various universities, different disciplines. And I do want to highlight that Anna Saylor was a student when she completed some of this work with me. So our brief agenda for the evening in terms of topics we're going to cover, I'm just going to have a brief overview talking a little bit about reading. And then I want to talk some about modifying materials to make them easier or more accessible to people to read, with a particular focus on some real life materials like medication, but that's just going to be one example. And then I'll spend some time talking about some of the current research related to technology and reading. So let's dive right in here. I think it's worth just mentioning, and every now and then as I'm thinking about research projects, my mind does drift a little bit to think about all the reading that we do during a day. Just before I came upstairs to do this talk, I was grabbing my mail out of the mailbox and thinking then again about how I'm doing reading just to check my mail and figure out what's a bill and what's junk mail and what's a Christmas card or another holiday card or a New Year's card from friends or family. So we read for a lot of reasons. We read sometimes because of medical needs. We need to understand medical information for safety. Sometimes we read just as part of our daily activities, like accessing a bus schedule or ordering food online. You may read for pleasure. I myself am hoping for some time over a break coming up to get to read for pleasure again a little bit. We do read to build relationships. We read text messages, we read posts on social media, and we respond to those posts as part of building relationships. And then we can also share information by reading. So again, assuming that I'm telling people things they already know, but I do think it's really helpful to think about reading in this really broad sense. And of course, people with aphasia want to read for all these and need to read for all of these same reasons. So as we first start to think about one way we can help people with aphasia be able to read, we consider what are called aphasia-friendly modifications or aphasia-friendly reading materials. There's a few different names that are out there. And I like to talk about these strategies or these approaches in kind of two different buckets. So the first can be ways that the text might be adjusted. So research suggests that people with aphasia benefit from text that's a little bit larger, that when there's increased white space between the lines of text, when vocabulary and sentences are simplified, that doesn't mean that it has to be childlike content. It of course is still adult content, but can be simplified in terms of the sentence structure. And then the addition of images. So pictures that represent something that's happening within the text. We see that a lot in magazines and newspapers, but not always in other types of reading materials. There's some strategies that people with aphasia can use. I was meeting with a friend and a research participant today, and he was using this strategy a lot, where he searched through the text to look for keywords that were meaningful to him, to try to help him interpret a larger paragraph of text, because that's really challenging for him. So looking for keywords can be something that's really helpful. People with aphasia also report asking a friend or family member to read out loud for them. They can follow along with your finger. I kind of showed that a second ago. And another strategy is even just to reduce some distractions in the room or in the environment. So finding a quiet space where there's good lighting, all of those things can be really helpful. And again, remember, this is just about things we can do with existing text to try to make them better or more understandable. My colleague and I have done this with some of our research studies. And so this is an example actually from the field of occupational therapy, where someone with aphasia might be assigned some type of home practice or home exercise to do. And in order to help them remember and understand their home exercise, a clinician might give them a sheet like this that has the task they're supposed to do, has the goal, has some images that show what the person's supposed to be doing. Ideally, it's their own images of themselves practicing. And then in this case, we were giving people some music to listen to while they were practicing. So that was an image that we included. And people with aphasia told us that using strategies like this was really helpful. And it did seem to improve their comprehension. This is another similar thing that we did to try to help understand. Sorry, it's a little bit blurry, but it's the real deal, something we're actually using during the project to help understand and have people with aphasia be able to complete a scale where they could provide us some information. And so this is a written scale that you can see had some larger text, some images, simple phrases to help support their comprehension. You can also see that we were writing on this to help support them further. Another example comes from, again, my student Anna's research project, and she was interested in how we could modify medication instructions, those like pages of paper that come when you get a medication. And so she took medications instructions that looked like this, and she modified them using some of those techniques I just talked about. And so that they looked like this. And I promise not to throw a lot of data at you, but if you focus here on the blue line, it does show that people with aphasia did better. They understood the instructions better when the text was modified. So I want to summarize here before we move on to our next topic, because I realize I didn't spend too much time on this. So some key takeaways related to aphasia-friendly modifications is that aphasia-friendly modifications seem to be helpful, but additional strategies may be needed. In particular, I do hear from some people with aphasia that they feel very dependent on others when it comes to using these strategies. And so we want to be sure that if a goal someone has is to be more independent, that we're helping them achieve that goal. And I'll talk about that more next. And then aphasia-friendly modifications tend to use up a lot more paper. And that does tend to be a concern that people have expressed. So I'm going to move on to talking more about technology. And the reason to talk about technology is that it is one way that we could increase the independence with which people with aphasia get some support when they're reading. And the specific type of technology I'm going to focus on is called text-to-speech systems. And there's a lot of these, and I'll talk about some of them later. But generally, a text-to-speech system takes some written text, like the paragraph you see here. You can take a photo of it, scan it, upload it. There's a lot of different strategies for getting it into the software or the system. The system then analyzes the text and it produces some type of spoken output. Most of the text-to-speech that we have talked about and that's been researched presents then to people both written text and spoken output at the same time. So in terms of potential benefits, why text-to-speech might be a good idea, text-to-speech has the possibility of reducing cognitive and language demands. Generally, and very generally, people with aphasia tend to benefit when they have multiple modalities. So when they can hear something and also see it. As I mentioned before, text-to-speech systems have the possibility of increasing independence, which is, if that is someone's goal, that's certainly something I as a clinician want to help them work towards. And then text-to-speech systems have a lot of different features that can be personalized. And personalization is a really important part of finding appropriate technology for people. With text-to-speech systems, you do have the capability to change the voice, to change how fast or slow the voice might be, to add highlighting that can follow along with the words or the sentences, and also potentially add picture support. So that's a brief overview kind of text-to-speech systems. This is not an exhaustive list of them, but there is a list here of text-to-speech systems. And these text-to-speech systems range in terms of which types of platforms they work on. Will they work with your iPhone? Will they work with an Android device, a Samsung tablet, your Mac computer? So these different systems work with different devices. And then there's also quite a range in price. Some of these are very expensive, a couple $100s, and some of them have free trials or free versions that you can use. So there's a wide range here. And I'm certain one of the questions might be, what would I recommend? And the answer will be, it depends, because there are a lot of considerations. But I definitely wanted to share some examples of what's available. So I'd like to briefly talk about what we know about aphasia and text-to-speech. So this is based on a number of research studies that my colleagues and I have completed. What we know is that most people with aphasia have better understanding when they use text-to-speech systems. So when they have both text and can hear it at the same time. Additionally, most people with aphasia prefer to use text-to-speech systems. There are some exceptions. Some people with really mild aphasia don't tend to like it as much. And then in terms of the rate, most people with aphasia prefer a kind of medium rate. And what is also interesting is that when the rate is too fast, people tend to have to reread the text many times, so it slows them down overall. And if the rate of speech is too slow, people get distracted or bored and tend to stop listening. And so there does seem to be some sweet spot, which is a little different for each person, but it falls in kind of a medium range of speed. And then most people prefer some type of highlighting. For some people, that is each sentence has highlighting. In some people, it's each word. So in general, what the research tells me is that people are different and have different preferences. But generally, I think text-to-speech is something worth trying and then adjusting some of these features to see what works best for someone. So a few things to think about, kind of takeaways from this text-to-speech section. One, instead of text-to-speech, if you don't have that available, or you want to just try something out similar, you could get an audiobook. The libraries tend to have a lot of free audiobooks that you can check out. And you could listen to the audiobook and follow along with a paper book. I know many people with aphasia who've been very successful with that strategy. You may say you want to try one of these text-to-speech systems, maybe one of the free trials, and see what it's like for you. But I do recommend adjusting the features. You also could look for some aphasia-friendly texts or modify them yourself. And then you could combine some use of technology with aphasia-friendly text. Be sure to test out what strategies work best for you, or if you're the care partner of someone with aphasia, what works best for them. And then I also recommend joining a book club. There's a number of book clubs, either that meet in person or are virtual, and those can be a great experience. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about book clubs and my experience in book clubs, which I honestly have been doing since I was a graduate student, which is fun to say. So that's about all I have to say to all of you, but I certainly am happy to answer questions, and I think we'll have some more information to share as your questions come in. I do want to highlight this is my contact information. I'm happy to have people contact me or follow our lab on Facebook or follow me on Twitter. I only really tweet about aphasia or kind of academic related content. So there should be some good content there. And then just before I let Jen talk, because I know there's some things she wants to say, I just want to say thank you to everyone before your questions even come in, because I'm very appreciative of the opportunity.
Thank you so much. When I saw that medication pamphlet, my head hurt a little bit. And when I saw how long and dense that was, I really appreciated the modification that was made to it.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people without aphasia do like it as well.
So actually somebody in our audience asked if the slides will be available. I do want to mention that this is a recorded session, so you can always check the video back again on YouTube. But do you have any comment about that?
I'm happy to, if the National Aphasia Association has a way to make them available, I'm happy to share a version of the slides. I may take out a couple of things that either are images that I don't have the rights to or something like that, but I'm happy to leave the content in and give a version if it's possible to share it out. I'm happy to do that.
Sure, thank you. I think we would be able to put maybe like a link on our website. So maybe check back with us on aphasia.org/ask-the-expert. And I'll put that link in the chat box. Okay, so someone in our audience asks, can you give insight into the value of reading aloud?
Yeah, absolutely. So reading aloud is really an interesting thing because in terms of a daily activity, something that we need to be able to do or want to be able to do, the only real type of reading out loud that we tend to do or need to be good at is maybe if you're reading to a small child. We don't tend to do a lot of reading aloud. So I often talk to clients about, what's your goal? Do you have a goal to read out loud to somebody? But certainly reading out loud is one of the things that we know can help in terms of improving spoken expression. I don't think we have a lot of research that suggests whether or not it helps with reading comprehension. To be honest, having to speak and understand what you're reading at the same time can be sometimes really hard for people with aphasia. So the short answer is, I think it depends on what your goal is. If you want to get better at speaking or better at reading out loud for reading out loud purposes, then I think reading out loud can be a really important part of a comprehensive treatment program. If you want to get better at reading for understanding, you don't necessarily need to practice reading aloud. So I hope that answers that question.
Thank you. Another person in our audience mentioned, so in some of the NAA online groups, we talk about accommodations at work. Do you know if any speech language pathologists go deeper into how to write for those accommodations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'm assuming that means, so like do I know of speech language pathologists who've worked to help people get accommodations at work for being better able to read materials. I don't know about that, but I do know in terms of, I'm thinking more about educational purposes, which isn't the same as a work purpose, but for educational purposes, there's typically ways to get accommodations for things like text-to-speech systems that can support people. So I would encourage people to talk to their employer, particularly if they know of a type of technology that would support them in reading. I think some employers may be really supportive of a strategy like that. A lot of the systems can be costly, but some of them aren't super high cost. So that may be something that an employer would be interested in helping someone do. But unfortunately, I know about other work accommodations, but I'm not sure about reading work accommodations.
Thank you. So another question that we got that was pre-submitted: if I focus on adaptive or compensatory strategies, will that hinder my recovery?
Yeah, this is a great question in general, and it doesn't just apply to reading. And there's a number of people who've been trying to research this topic and have found, and specifically related to aphasia, and have started to find some evidence of this. Generally, the evidence points to no, having a compensatory strategy won't hinder your recovery. I don't know that anyone has studied this specifically related to reading. So I want to be really careful to say this is typically studied in spoken expression, not in reading. But most things that I know and understand about aphasia indicate that the more somebody is able to participate or be engaged or involved in an activity, the more they continue to get better at said activity. And so if someone was my client, even though we don't have the evidence for sure, I would encourage them to use compensatory strategies to the point where it helps them participate or engage, because that stimulation tends to be really helpful for recovery. And that goes across a lot of different areas, not just reading. But certainly there are ways to work on both compensatory strategies and restorative activities within kind of a comprehensive approach to treatment. That was kind of a long answer. My short answer is no, it shouldn't affect it. But certainly there are some things to think about in terms of balancing how you spend some of your time.
Thank you. The next few questions we have are more about reading as a fun, leisurely activity. So someone in our audience asks, my desire to read disappeared after my stroke. I can read fine, but I don't want to very much. Any suggestions why that happened or what to do?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And we're doing a study right now that's based on reading. And I've been talking to two of our new participants this week, and neither of them are very interested in reading for pleasure after their aphasia either. And, but they are interested in practicing reading, like getting better at it, even though they aren't necessarily motivated to read a novel or a magazine. So I don't completely understand. It can be that even if it's not a super challenging activity, that it still is a bit more mentally exhausting, or it does take some cognitive resources that you're not super aware of, and that your body is kind of trying to conserve so that you can participate in other types of language activities. And that's part of why I brought up at the beginning that there's all these different types of reading. So I guess I would encourage you to, and anyone who's feeling that, to think about reading more broadly. And so if it's reading novels for pleasure used to be really nice for you, maybe try some strategies and see if it becomes easier or faster and you enjoy it more. Or maybe try reading something else. Try reading online blogs, or try reading a newspaper, or try reading a newsletter, or something that's just a little bit different, because maybe your taste in reading has just changed and evolved over time. And there could be something that sparks some new interests. I know many people who've developed new interests and hobbies after a stroke. for many reasons. And that could be some of what you're experiencing as well.
Thank you. So we actually had a few questions about alternative ways to enjoy reading. Mm-hmm. Can watching television with subtitles act as an exercise to support reading?
Yeah, this is such a great question and something I'm really fascinated by. So I'm so glad to have a question about this, because I know that there are people with aphasia out there doing this and that they say that it helps. So I will say, again, back to the evidence, because I like to talk about what's out there. I don't have any evidence that supports that if you turn on subtitles, that reading is going to become easier, or that you'll become better at reading because of it. On the contrary, though, it should help if you have any trouble comprehending what's happening in the TV show or movie or newscast that you're watching. And so it should help with some of your auditory comprehension. It might make it faster, less effortful, or just more accurate. Again, that's just based on sort of a theory. We expect that it would help at least some people. So that's one thing I guess I would encourage people, if they have any trouble in doing that type of activity, certainly put on subtitles. And even if you're someone who struggles with reading, I think you'll find that subtitles could be really helpful. And the other part is, just because I don't have evidence that shows that it might improve your reading doesn't mean that it might not. So if it isn't hurting, I don't think that it's a bad thing to do. I myself kind of like watching with subtitles. It sometimes makes it easier for me to understand what's happening too.
Thank you so much. So we have another question in our Q&A chat box. Hi, Sarah. Given that many people with aphasia can read individual words, but still lose the ability to read a string of words when the words are put together, what is the real problem when a person with aphasia is unable to read sentences, but not single words? Or do you have some citations about that? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't know that I have citations off the top of my head, but I just had such a great conversation with an occupational therapist about this today, because she was saying, well, the person did so well with single words, almost 100% accuracy. But as soon as we started to put them into sentences, particularly complex sentences or sentences with any unusual syntactic structure, people did start to struggle more. And so I think part of the question was, why might that be? So there's a few reasons. One is just a numbers problem, right? So the more words the person has to decode and comprehend in order to understand something, the more challenging it would be. It also is taking it beyond just the semantic level of understanding the word, but then we're adding the additional task of having to understand the sentence structure. So for example, it may be really easy to understand the sentence, the cat chased the dog, but it could be harder to understand the sentence, the dog who was chased by the cat was wearing a red sweater. And so those more complex sentences require understanding of sentence structure. So we're really making the task more complex. I know this wasn't part of this question, but I just want to bring this back to, that's in part why the strategy of looking for keywords can be helpful, because people can sometimes decode single words. The challenge is it doesn't assist with sentence structure. And that's where I think strategies like having a text-to-speech system, having sentences modified to be more simple sentences, or having someone read out loud can be really helpful. So I know that wasn't part of the question, but I can't help but loop back to some of the strategies.
Thank you so much. So let's go back to reading for pleasure. We had a question about graphic novels. Can you talk a bit about using graphic novels in establishing reading skills in aphasia?
Yeah, I wish that I had a bunch of knowledge about this. The most knowledge that I have is only from clinical experience, which is that I know people with aphasia have found some success in reading graphic novels. And it makes a lot of sense. In fact, if I can take my slides back really quick, And if we think about some of these aphasia-friendly modifications, graphic novels include some of these strategies. I will say they do not often include increased text size, because my experience is the text can be really small and sometimes challenging to read. But they do often have some simplified vocabulary or simple sentence structure. And some of that's because it's using a lot of spoken output. So it's using a lot of dialogue, which I think can be sometimes more simplified sentences. And then graphic novels almost always include images as well. And so although my experience is only knowing that some people with aphasia had success with them in the clinic, it makes sense to me that they would be successful because they use a number of elements from aphasia-friendly modifications that we know to be helpful. I'm just going to go back to the contact slide just in case. Don't want to confuse people.
Thank you. So you talked a little bit about book clubs. Do you want to talk more about your experiences with book clubs?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had the honor of, when I was a graduate student, of getting to help start a book club, a small book club at Western Michigan University. And that was a wonderful experience. That was within our university clinic with university clients who regularly attended the university. And since that time, in my previous position, we also ran a book club at Duquesne University in the clinic. And we mostly focused on individuals who had more mild or who had less severe, maybe is the way to say that, aphasia, and who had an interest in reading. And we used reading as kind of like many book clubs do. We used reading as a springboard to be able to have conversation and discussion. But one thing I really wanted to talk about was, and I'm going to forget some of the names here, so I apologize. But when I had the opportunity to attend some aphasia groups in Christchurch in New Zealand, and their book club, and I know this is happening some other places in the United States and across the world, but their book club did something that I thought was just so fantastic, which is that they met at their public library. So they were meeting in a place that was part of the community rather than kind of in a separate entity. So they weren't affiliated necessarily with the university, but they were affiliating themselves with the library and used library space and used library books to participate in their book club. And I think for me, that's a really great example of how I think one goal, if someone was interested in book clubs, one goal could be to participate in aphasia-related book clubs, but maybe eventually use that as a foundation to having an aphasia group that's a mixed aphasia group. So a book club that's a mixed aphasia and people without aphasia. I'm really interested in this idea that we could have a community book club where a lot of people would benefit from many types of supports, and people with aphasia could participate with people who don't have aphasia and have a really rich and interesting discussion about books and related topics. And that's what I found, even though this group was only people with aphasia, I found their discussion to be really rich, just like any other book club I'd ever been to that didn't involve people with aphasia. People really dove deep into some of the topics, and I found that to be really fascinating. So I just want to encourage people, if they're interested in anything like that, to know that there's a lot of book clubs for people with aphasia who are really supportive of modifying materials or giving people the opportunity to, for example, watch some of the movie to catch up if they're falling behind, or use whatever strategies they need to participate in the book club. So yeah, I just think that can be a really great way to get back into the pleasure of reading. And I hope people aren't too intimidated to take something like that on.
So at the National Aphasia Association, we actually have a book club as well. It meets online every Thursday, and our host is in the audience. Do you mind if I take her off of mute for a second?
Oh, not at all.
Great. Oops, okay, 1 second. There we go. Hi, Doreen.
Hello, everyone.
Sorry.
I'm sorry I can't see you, but I can hear you. Thank you, Dr. Sarah. My name is Doreen Mendez. I have aphasia, and I have had aphasia for 9 years. It's been, at the beginning, I was locked in, so I couldn't speak at all for 3 years.
Wow.
And so, yes, I've been through different phases and different types of aphasia also. And so, and I am an avid reader and also a polyglot. I used to speak 7 languages, and my love for language is because of reading in different languages. And so, when National Aphasia Association approached to see if we could work in this setting doing a book club, I find that not only people with aphasia, with other conditions that is not just aphasia, were willing and they wanted to engage. So for me, I tried. I started first with another national organization that was wonderful, and the book that we choose that I tried that time, it was a Mockingbird. And so it was very difficult, the subject, everything for everyone. Yes, and people in different stage and different types of aphasia, and other people that have multiple sclerosis or other things are engaged also. And so that was such a wonderful experience that I wanted to do this one for National Aphasia Association also. A little apprehensive, and with the help of incredible help with Jen. Jen has been instrumental just allowing us to keep on topic, and also to do the exercise. And so that's the what I needed to continue the work. And so I find very interested that you mentioned that about the library movement that's happening around the world. It's not just in United States. And for you, when you were a graduate student, I found here I'm in New York. So in New York, I find that there is a movement in its public libraries, and I'm engaged here in the Bronx, New York. But it's a lot of work still for somebody who follows and develops book clubs. It's a lot of work, and especially if you don't have somebody like Jen with me 24 hours.
Doreen always gives me too much credit.
Yes. The thing is, it's not administration, but it's also actually contributing to the actual book club also. So the people that are participants, they feel like they have a professional person in there. In my case, my forte is just being easygoing with everyone. And so that's how I want to have a conversation, or the subject, just easygoing with questions, and move the how do you say the conversation over, not away, but in. And Jen is great at also bring us back into reality to the world. Yes. I just want to say thank you for being in this session. We are very big fans. I follow you all over Twitter, so I know what you're doing. And thank you so much for everything that you've been doing. And Jen, we love you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Doreen, and thank you for all that you're doing. I think that's another great example that people with aphasia might be interested in leading or co-leading book groups as well. And I think Doreen's right, it can be a lot of work, especially if you're encouraging people to use some of these strategies or creating materials and things like that, but it can have a really great outcome. So well worth the work.
Yeah, and what I really love about Doreen's book club is the focus is just on chatting. You know, sometimes we do start with a book, but we always end up on some random topic, and it's just a lot of fun. We also have a few care partners in our group, so it's just very like fun and easygoing.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to the questions. If there are concerns about getting too tired too early in the day, how can we plan for reading, or when is the best time to read?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And this changes, I think, during different points in rehabilitation. So, but one general recommendation I would make is that if there are, it may not be the same every day. And so there may be certain days that there's a certain activity that you really need to have the maximum amount of your energy available. And so that may not be the day to read beforehand. And so looking at each day and thinking about maybe almost like a scale, and you have some events or activities that might be a 5 that are going to take up a lot of your energy. And so which activities do you have that are a 5? And then you maybe want to plan your day around them. So can you take a nap before? Maybe you're someone who gets a big burst of energy right after you exercise or right after you eat. Or maybe those are times of the day where you get really tired. And so just, I think planning reading as part of a whole day that looks at what are those high level, those like 5, like I really need as much energy as possible. And what are some of those tasks that are like low level, like a 1, where, you know, I don't actually need a lot of energy to fold laundry or whatever that low level energy thing is for you. So, and then I guess the other thing I would encourage, because I have heard from a lot of people with aphasia about how reading, even if reading isn't too challenging for them, it can be slower and more exhausting than it used to be. And so that may be good reason to build in some automatic breaks. Maybe you are someone that before your aphasia, you could spend an hour reading and not get fatigued. But maybe now you need to set a timer and stop yourself after 15 or 20 minutes and do some other type of task, and then come back to reading at another point in the day. I know it's not exactly what you're asking, but I know when we ask people to do activities or exercises at home, we do something really similar where we give them like an idea of how much time they might practice, but then are really clear that you can do some of this in the morning and then take a break and do some of it later in the day. So don't feel like reading is only a once a day activity if it's very fatiguing for you. So I hope that's helpful. And that goes for all activities too.
Thank you so much. We have another question about book clubs. Are virtual book clubs more difficult than in-person book clubs? Any suggestions for the virtual way?
Yeah, I'm not sure that virtual book clubs are any more challenging than just virtual aphasia groups in general. And they both have advantages and disadvantages. So I'll say right now that I do lead a virtual group with some students through another organization. And it is a lot of work to lead virtual groups. And I have about a decade of experience helping students lead an in-person group. And that's also a lot of work and has its own challenges. So I would say in terms of a virtual book group, or maybe just virtual sessions in general, there's a few things that I think make those sessions run a bit more smoothly. One is to have some type of clear agenda. So Jen mentioned in the group that Doreen runs, they kind of start on the book, and I don't know if it's planned, but then kind of go off into other discussions or other topics. And maybe the group just lays that out from the beginning. This is how we're going to start. This is what we're going to do in the middle. And this is what the end is going to kind of look like. So I think having some sort of plan or agenda, it doesn't have to be a minute per minute plan, but a general plan can help everyone be on the same page. And that helps make transitions a little easier. I also know in our groups, we try to have some ground rules about how you take turns. This has nothing to do with aphasia and everything to do with this virtual environment where it can be challenging to know when another person is about to speak. And so we have a mixture of muting and hand raising and chat feature and things like that we use to try to help manage our group. And I don't think there's a magic formula to what works in a virtual group or a virtual book club. But I think that having ground rules in general that everyone sort of agrees on for turn taking can be really helpful. One of the great advantages, though, of a virtual book club is that just like I'm sharing my screen today, it's much easier to have shared materials that many people can see right there in front of them. And so I think that can provide a really nice advantage for some people. And then, of course, there's the advantage that people who might not usually make it to an in-person session could potentially participate. So, but certainly there are challenges. If you have other questions too, most of my experience is from virtual groups in general, but I'm happy to share some tips or tricks. Those are two of the main things I think that help us the most. Having a plan and having some ground rules or established guidelines.
Thank you. So we actually have another person who would like to chat a little bit. His name is James. He's actually a student.
Mm-hmm.
Let me get him on here. There we go. Oops. Hi, James. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Thanks. Thanks for chatting. Do you want to maybe provide a little bit of your background and your story?
Sure, I'd love to. So I had a fall from a top bunk, and I had cracked my skull, and I had two hemorrhages on both sides of my skull and my brain. It was one of them was. Give me 1 second, please.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I forget.
That's okay.
So one side was a subdural hemorrhage and the right side was an epidural hemorrhage. And so I had a brain stroke. And that, from what I heard, I did not know what type of aphasia that I had. I've actually looked through all my notes of the therapy that I went through. And I'm not exactly sure what type of aphasia I had, but one thing that I still do from my speech language pathologist is she kind of told me that I should get a planner, so that I can start writing down a lot of different stuff that I need to remember, doctor's appointments, exams coming up. I just transferred to a Catholic university. I was at a community college for 3 years. And it's my first time going full time.
Mm-hmm.
And the prerequisites that I have to finish my first academic year is, one of them is, the only prerequisites I didn't take at the community college was the science courses. So I'm taking human anatomy and physiology 1 this semester. And I was struggling a little bit in the beginning. I think on the first exam, I got a 57. And then my professor told me that whatever, if I get a better grade, it'll replace that. And so I ended up getting a 91 on the final exam because I get to use accommodations, like cue cards. And I go to a lot of tutoring all the time. I actually had a pre-med tutor who knew a lot about human anatomy. And then my lab professor allowed me to use this thing called ways to remember, where, in the lab, you're seeing a lot of models and pictures. And so I got to do this thing called ways to remember, where she would put the name of the part of the chapter or what it is, like the skull or the bones or the cells, and then what reminds me on it to the right side. And so that really helped me out a lot. Reminds me a lot of what I went through with speech language pathology And I'm actually, next fall, I'm going to be enrolling in the communication sciences and language disorders, because I was so inspired by my speech therapist that I would like to start being able to work with others that have language disorders, just like myself. So basically, a lot of my stuff that I wanted to ask you is, like, do you have any suggestions for reading? Sometimes it, I mean, I actually get to keep the textbooks. I asked for physical textbooks for my ADA, and I get to keep the physical textbooks. Even though I tried to turn them in, they said, no, you get to keep them. But I was wondering if you have any suggestions with reading, you know, because like sometimes I'll be reading something and it just goes in one ear and out the other.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think some of the strategies that I talked about in the session could be helpful. So you could see if there's text-to-speech systems that might be helpful with your textbook. Having the physical textbooks is great. There's also, if you have online textbooks, there's some really great ways to have those read out loud for you too. So both definitely might be an option. And then I would use some of the strategies that I had mentioned and see which of those you can experiment a little bit with, maybe thinking about what you've learned in classes, and think about and try out different strategies to see what might be helpful for you. But I'm really glad to hear you have a lot of these supports in place. It sounds like you're a really good advocate for yourself. And I think that's probably one of the most important things, is to continue to advocate for what helps and supports you in terms of reading and being able to be successful in school. So thank you so much for sharing all of that, James. I really appreciate it.
I actually have another question that was pre-submitted, but it relates to something that James had said. So this person asks, when I'm reading, I don't remember what I've read. Will that get better? And what can I do to help with this?
Yeah, it is kind of tricky, because first we have to understand what we read and then be able to remember it. And so it's hard to know, without necessarily working with you individually, to know exactly where some of that breakdown or challenge is. But a couple things that you might consider, or other people who are having a similar challenge might consider. One, try maybe some of these strategies to help with comprehension, some of the strategies I talked about in the session, and see if that helps. If you're remembering things better, then maybe it was some challenge with fully understanding what you read in the first place. And by understanding, I mean understanding the language, not kind of conceptually understanding it, but understanding the language of what you read. And then, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. And so that's one thing that you might try to do. There's also some really great examples that other book clubs have done. One example that comes to mind, and I'm not sure if the National Aphasia Association has similar resources, but I know the Aphasia Center of California has some book connection resources, and they have some great examples of things that can be helpful even while you're reading. So looking at like chapter summaries. So for example, if you were reading something where you had materials like that available, you could use resources like that to help yourself remember, or to check in and make sure that you're remembering. I know when we've done some book clubs, or even in some of our studies with people, we have used some of the book connection materials or similar like materials where we've provided summaries after a chapter, for example, or had people create a character list and keep that character list next to you while you're reading a novel or something like that, so that you have some kind of external supports to help you with remembering some of that material. So some of it depends on exactly what it is you're reading. And then again, I think this challenge of, is it that you're not remembering, or that it was hard to understand some of the language to begin with? So I hope some of those can be helpful to you and to others who maybe struggle a little bit with that particular challenge.
Thank you. Another person asks, I am I am bilingual. Does it matter which language I'm reading in?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's similar to the question of if you're bilingual, which, language should you do aphasia therapy in? My typical recommendation is whichever language you consider your primary language, so the language you want to use most often, is what you should be focusing on. For some people, that may differ, I realize, with reading versus speaking. So that could present potentially a challenge. But if your goal is to read for pleasure, I would say choose which language is easier for you to read. And then, you should be better able to enjoy the reading that you're doing. If it's to try to work on getting better at reading, then I think it's a similar answer. Which language do you think you'll do the most of that type of reading? And then practice in that language. But unfortunately, we don't have a lot of research studies on that topic, but generally from what I know about bilingualism and aphasia, that's what I would recommend.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question, by the way.
Can you tell us a little bit about the studies that are going on at your lab right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of studies where we're still recruiting participants with aphasia, we have a study with some colleagues not related to reading, where we are studying emotional growth after aphasia. So after somebody has some type of traumatic event, then the person may experience some type of emotional growth. And this has been studied in people with other types of traumatic events, traumatic brain injury, and even stroke. But people with aphasia have been excluded from this type of research. Actually, it's not related to reading, but in part because it's hard to do some of the assessments because of some reading challenges. And so my colleagues and I, including some people with aphasia, I want to give them a good shout out. My colleagues and I are actively recruiting people with aphasia to participate in that study. That's a national study, so it's virtual, so individuals don't need to live here in Pittsburgh in order to participate. And there is some information on my Facebook page, and I can be sure to reshare some of that information as well. That's the only study where we're currently collecting data from people who live anywhere. In terms of other studies, if folks are just interested in what's happening in our lab, we are here in Pittsburgh, we're recruiting people to practice reading at home using a tablet and an app that we provide to them. We're asking them to read at home and answer comprehension questions. I work on that study with a colleague who's an occupational therapist. And we're mostly interested in reading, but we're interested in particular in how people practice at home. So it's specifically people with aphasia, because again, they've been left out of a lot of this research. So when we give people things to practice at home, whether it's exercises with your arms or your legs, speaking exercises, reading exercises, we want to know what motivates you to practice. What does your practice look like? How can we increase your motivation and your success with practice? And then I think I'll mention just two other studies or kind of groups I'm working with. One group, we're studying friendship in aphasia. And unfortunately, we are done collecting data for that study. But that group will continue to do work. So stay tuned on our Facebook page. We're asking questions about what it's like for people with aphasia to make friends and make new friends and maintain long-term friendships. And then the last one to talk about is some really related to reading. Some colleagues and I have given some people with aphasia some novels to read at home using text-to-speech systems and measured their comprehension. So this is the first time that we know of that people with aphasia have been asked to read a novel at home, and then we're studying how well they understood that novel. This study is completely based on what people with aphasia told us. They said, we want to be able to read novels, and you keep asking us to read sentences. So we have taken our studies to the next level and asked them to do that kind of work. And it's not easy work. So we've been appreciative of those studies. And then looking forward, that group is really interested in book clubs. So stay tuned to see what work we might do related to book clubs. We're hoping to see how technology can help support people when they participate in book clubs, and looking at ways that we can kind of keep this going in the direction, this work that we're interested in, going in a direction where it's what people with aphasia really tell us they want. So we're very focused on that. So thank you for letting me share a few of those examples. Certainly check out our my Facebook page, our lab's Facebook page. Right now, I think you'll see some pictures of my new students in my lab, but there is definitely some information about our research studies, as well as other research studies going on around the country or around the world.
And if our friends in the audience want to get involved, should they email you, or?
People can certainly email me. And if there's a study that's a good fit for them, I'm happy to share that information. And also just keep an eye on the Facebook page, and feel free to, the flyers will usually have contact information. So either of them is totally fine.
Great. I'm really looking forward to reading about your studies and your research. So.
Oh, thanks, Jen. Yeah, I feel so fortunate because they are studies that are very meaningful to me. And that's a really great place to be in your career. So I'm very, very pleased with that.
We only have a few more minutes, but what is one takeaway message that you hope that everyone comes away with today?
Yeah, I think, although I fear that sometimes this isn't the answer people want, but I think to really think about personalization is really important, I think, and knowing that one strategy or one piece of technology is not going to be one size fits all. So what works for Jen may not work for me. What works for one person with aphasia may not work for the next person with aphasia. And so please don't give up on strategies or technology right away if they don't work for you. Look for different strategies or how you might modify them. Because I think there are things out there that will help people with aphasia with reading, but it's just not a one size fits all approach. So it takes a lot of patience.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise about reading, cognition, and communication. You've offered such great insight and tools and tips that can support reading with aphasia. Thank you everyone who participated today. I've put in the chat Dr. Sarah Wallace's Facebook page, her email address, and her Twitter handle, so you can copy and paste that. And I'm also putting the aphasia.org online events page, and that's where you can find information on the National Aphasia Association's book club and other online events. Just as a quick reminder, we do have 2 more Ask the Experts coming up in January. So on January 13th, we will be speaking with Dr. Roberta J. Ellman, who will be talking about the life participation approach to aphasia and the importance of aphasia groups. And then on January 27th, we have an Ask the Author with Segonia Tansman, who will speak about her book, Hope After Stroke. Thank you guys so much for joining us. If you are joining us on YouTube, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. See you next time.
Thanks, everybody.